So first of all, when we're talking about a budget, we could be talking about a company, we could be talking about a town, we could be talking about a state or the government. These two words, surplus and deficit, are critical for you to understand and be able to use. There typically is a question in a test around surplus and deficit and being able to use them. So just in general terms, surplus is when we bring in more money than we spend. That's an ideal situation, right? If you're talking about your own budget, if you earned $500 this week, but you only spent $300, then great. Then that was a surplus week, right? A deficit is the opposite. It's when we actually end up spending more than we bring in, right? So if I have a month where I bring in $2,000, but I end up spending $2,400, then I'm running a deficit. The amount of the deficit or the surplus can just be figured out by subtracting. So let's turn to our own federal government. This is fairly recent, 2017. Got 2 other budget years since then that we could look at, but let's analyze whether we had a surplus or a deficit by using those numbers. So I want you to do number 1, calculate the difference and talk about the budget in terms of a surplus or deficit using your number. I'm going to give you a minute for that. Okay, so first of all, is this a deficit or a surplus?
Deficit.
Deficit.
Yeah, absolutely. And how much is the deficit? Because you want to include that in your sentence as well.
.66.
Okay.
0.66.
Okay, so 0.66, 0.66, those mean the same thing. That 0 in front is not really important. Excel is putting it there kind of by default. But careful here in ignoring the number word, right? Because that's actually a very significant part of this. If we just kind of ignore this part and we say 0.66, I mean, what does that mean? 66 cents? Are we talking about? I mean, because that sounds like, well, that's not that big of a deal. 0.66 what?
Would it be million?
It's the same units that it was before. This is trillions, right? In math, the general principle is that if you're not talking about the same thing, you can't add or subtract, right? So if I have 9 cats and 4 dogs and I want to add them together, I can't really do that. I can't just say that there's 13 unless I change it to the same thing, like 13 pets, right? If it is the same thing, then the word is just going to follow through. So in this case, the fact that this is trillions and this is trillions means that this is trillions, because when I subtract to find the difference, it's still, I'm talking about trillions. That's just the unit. Now, I would argue that this is not the best way to say this, because now because we did the subtraction, we don't even have a trillion to talk about. So why are we in the trillions? So this is a good opportunity to practice taking a decimal and a word number and taking it into standard form to then re-say it in a better way in sort of back to the number word combo. So go ahead and try to write that number out in standard form, and then we'll talk about how you would say that. Well, what does 1 trillion look like? Remember the simpler, similar problem-solving approach, right? You don't know how to write this. Okay, well, what does 1 trillion look like? Go ahead and lay that out for me.
It's 1 with 1000.
Okay, that's one packet.
000.
That's another one.
000.
Yeah, that's another one.
000.
Exactly. 4 packets of 3, right? 12 zeros. That's what a trillion looks like. This number, 0.66 trillion, is not even a trillion. Remember that one of the techniques I showed you was take your number, turn the decimal into a comma, and then finish your packet of 3. So this is going to be basically the same size number, right? But instead of having 1 trillion, I've got 0 trillions. I have something that's close, that the next digit over is a 6, and the one after that is a 6, but I do not have a trillion. So this is the way the number would look, and I would not write the 0 in the comma, obviously, because that looks kind of silly, but basically I have this number. So I still have lots and lots of zeros. Most common mistakes are for people to write the 66 on the left side of the comma and make that into 66 trillion. But if you listen to it, you think about it, 66 trillion is way different from 0.66 trillion. 0.66 trillion, I don't even have a trillion yet. So now back to trying to say this in a better form of the number words. What am I talking about? What is 0.66 trillion? 660 what?
$100 trillion.
No,
Million.
not quite. 660 million would look like this. 660, and then I've got my 6 zeros. That's 660 million.
So it's trillion.
Nope, it's not
Billion.
660 trillion. I
It's
heard it. Yep, billion, 660 billion. Okay, so then the sentence would be something like, in 2017, the US federal government had a deficit of $660 billion. It's a little hard to kind of appreciate what that even means, because $1 billion is a lot of money, right? Most of us have never seen that. I sure haven't. And billions even a level past like what we're usually comfortable with. Like I've never even seen $1 million. So what does $1 million look like? I've seen movies with suitcases full of money, but I don't really know what $1 million looks like. And a billion is 1,000 million. And I'm talking about 660 of those things. So thousands of millions and 660, it's just kind of mind boggling. I think it's worth taking a little bit of time to look at this picture and make sense of this, because it's a larger national conversation that sometimes people are kind of thinking about and talking about in their communities as they worry about the state of our country. If you look back historically, this is kind of an interesting graph because it's got positives and negative values, but this goes back, you can actually follow this link, and it doesn't take you to this graph, it takes you to where all this information came from. And I think I pulled up some data off of it the other day. Oh no, that's CPI, forget it. So what does this graph on the left tell you? One of the things that we want to practice in this class is looking at graphs and tables and kind of making sense out of what information is provided. What does the graph on the left tell you about our country?
I see more declining declining from 1970 to 1990, and it's going increasing in 2000, and then it's decreasing back in from what is that 2000? Well, increased, in between, I would say 2005 and decreased down.
Right. So remember that we're talking about, you can see it in the title of the graph, it's deficits and surpluses. So those bars that point downwards are deficits. Those are times when our country spent more than we brought in, right? Where does the money come in from in terms of income? Well, there's various places, but the biggest thing is tax, right? A country taxes in order to create income because we're not selling things on Amazon. We're a country, and countries and states and you know cities, local environments have to tax the people who live there in order to generate income so that they can spend money on things that they think are important. So one of the key takeaways is that over the last 40 years, deficits are much more common than surpluses. That doesn't mean surpluses are unheard of. There were a couple of years in the late 90s when there were some surpluses, but it's pretty unusual. The other thing you might notice is that we've gotten used to the idea of having deficits that are larger. And when we started this graph in the 70s, the deficits were pretty small. I mean, really tiny compared to where we are now. I mean, 20 billion, maybe 30 billion, getting up closer to 100 billion. Not into the 80s did we see a deficit of over 100 billion. And eventually in the early 90s, we got a deficit of 300 billion. And then we started kind of chipping away at that. And we ended up with a surplus. If you're a student of history or you like thinking about these things, I think it's interesting to go back and kind of think about where there were big changes and what led to those deficits. A lot of times it was political decisions. Sometimes it was kind of geopolitical events, historical events, right? Like, for instance, the big change from switching over from the surplus, going back to the deficit, somewhere in 2000, was that the crash of the dot-com bubble? Was it the tax cuts that the new Republican administration brought in that lowered income? Was it the decision to go to war? The terrorist attacks in 2001? I don't know the story well enough to know what it was. But we entered into a situation there in the early 2000s where we were getting up to, $400 billion deficits. Those were the biggest deficits we had ever seen. And then those kind of fell back, still had deficits, but they were smaller deficits. And then what happened here in this big spike at the end? Where did that come from? We went from almost 500 billion to way over $1 trillion deficit. What happened there? Come on, I know you guys were alive. We don't have any 10-year-olds in this class. So use the x-axis to kind of figure out the time scale, right? This is somewhere around 2010. Our deficits went kind of crazy. You there? What happened around 2010 that caused our deficits to go bananas?
Recession?
Yeah, the last recession. We're in a new recession here, but the last recession, which was brought on by this collapse of the financial sector and people making bad loans, and then banks kind of processed those loans, them out to people, and then all of a sudden there was a contraction and people couldn't pay their mortgages anymore, and that just led to a terrible collapse. Well, there was a decision in there where the Fed went to Congress and said, we need $800 billion to bail out the financial sector, or else the whole financial sector is going to collapse. People aren't going to be able to borrow money. We can't answer for what's going to happen. And the Congress actually said, no, we're not going to give you the money. Then there was a terrible collapse in the stock market. And then they came back the next week and Congress reluctantly agreed to give $800 billion, and that's called the TARP program. So in short terms, when there's a terrible recession, one of the things that governments do is they spend a lot of money to stimulate the economy. And this happened again in the last couple of months with the stimulus checks, and the SBA, which is the Small Business Administration loans. The government attempted to pump a lot of money into the economy in order to make sure people still kept buying things and still had access to, they didn't get kicked out of their house and they got their electricity staying on and things like that. And it's interesting that we're kind of back in the same situation. And I think there was a lot of unhappiness about the deficits in that time frame and the size of the deficits, and you can see why relatively those deficits were way larger than anything the country had ever seen before. But we're actually headed back into that same territory, and even before the recession, with the tax cuts that were passed in 2016, we were back into $1 trillion deficit. So is that terrible? I mean, it's interesting to think about whether it's a bad program or not. It seems obvious to anybody who's financially responsible that you should generally not be spending more money than you have. But there are times when spending more money than you have, if you have the means to do it, is good in terms of the people in your country and how they're feeling about things. The other side of the deficit surplus conversation is the debt conversation, and debt is a different concept than deficit. Sometimes people get those terms confused. Debt is about how much money you owe to other people, and it's a little different between the country and the personal level. On a personal level, if I want to go buy a car, but I don't have enough money to buy it outright, I can ask the bank for a loan. And then the bank can decide whether to loan me the money or not, right? I mean, I could ask my cousin for a loan or my grandma for a loan if they have money. We typically talk to banks. The same is not true for countries. Well, at least not for the United States. The United States does not go to other countries and ask them if they can borrow money. They don't go to banks and ask them if they can borrow money. What they do is they offer their debt in terms of bonds to other places, and people invest in our country. They say, here's $1,000. I don't know what you're going to do with it, but I like your country. You seem to have a strong economy and a strong democracy, and so we trust that you're going to exist in the next 10 years and you're going to pay your debts. So I'm going to get my money back and I'm going to get interest on my money. So it's a kind of a different situation that sometimes gets confused when people are talking about it, because we think of our own borrowing. The country doesn't have to ask people for money. People come to us and give us money because they believe in our economy. But keep in mind that all of that depends on the believing in the economy and the believing in the country. If you don't believe in our country, or we default on our debt, then people maybe don't want to give us money anymore and say, I'm going to invest in your country. So it's a balancing between, needing to spend more money, needing to raise more money, which is generally through taxes, which nobody likes, and having people wanting to invest in the country because they believe in this, the system of democracy and the capitalist economy that we have here. So lots of kind of big issues there, but if you're interested in that kind of thing, there's other classes that go into that in more detail.